After the arrival of the railroad, farmers would just haul their grain to the railroad siding, and there would be a timber platform that would be relatively as high as the bottom of the boxcars, and they'd have earthen driveways up on either side. The farmers would bring their horse-drawn wagons up the driveway onto the platform and then load directly into the boxcar, either with bagged grain that had been bagged right on the farm, or loose grain they'd shovel into the boxcar. The disadvantage to that was that you had to just haul it from your farm. There was no place at the rail to store grain. So when the idea came for elevation, what that did is it took advantage of the natural flowing property of the grain plus the gravity feed. And by elevating the grain and putting it in bins above ground level, they could then take advantage of that, and it was made loading of the CPR boxcars very much more efficient and productive. So the railroad actually came up with a program. They didn't have the capital to build their own elevators, but what they did is they would say to a company, a grain handling company, we will lease you long-term lease, our property adjacent to the railroad tracks. You put up a elevator. And so this was a big inducement for the companies, and a large number of companies were formed in the area from approximately late 1880s through to the 1920s. I think they had to have 25,000 bushels of grain storage in one of these elevators in order to get a CPR long-term lease.
It was built in 1976 with a capacity of about 1 million bushels. It's done a number of expansions since then. We're now at roughly 4 million bushels, or around 100,000 tons. The concept of moving grain is very similar, whether it's a huge concrete or whether it's a wooden elevator. You use gravity as much as you can to move the grain. The rest is either by elevators or by conveyors. This was really the first farmer-owned, built terminal of its size on the prairies.
Our town was formed in 1908 when the railway came through, and at that time there were 2 elevators built. The UGG built in, I think, about 1926, and then in 1928 the Poole elevator came here. And so we actually had 4 elevators at one time here in Hepburn. And the elevator here was built at a cost of $16,423.80. An elevator of this size could be built by a crew of 18 guys in as short a time as 2 weeks.
This elevator that was built by the Lake of the Woods Milling Company had a capacity of 32,000 bushels. The milling companies spotted their elevators in areas where the quality of the grain was excellent for the milling of red fife wheat into flour. And this is one of the delivery points that produced that quality of grain. Yes, this is the oldest wood crib elevator in all of Canada. Opened for business in 1895, and it was in use until 1999. The architecture is an example of the very early days of elevator construction. And this was an early type of hip roof construction elevator that went through an experimental stage to try and get the most efficient model, which was the later years came into being around 1920. The standard slope-roofed elevators that is much higher than this building. This particular one is a cribbed bin elevator. This is what the method of construction was. And you can see here, this is all 2x6 timber laid one on the other. And so you've got a tremendous amount of material in this building, and it also gave it a lot of strength, which is one of the reasons why this particular building lasted as long as it did. It has the crib construction, and it has the architecture of a hip roof, which means it is more of a squat, solid building, less height to it. And these things really did aid in the conservation of this building. Lake of Lake of the Woods Milling Company, which was a Montreal headquartered company. And they put up the capital, and this really helped the CPR. And that's how it really tied in. The railroad, the Homestead Act, which brought the farmers from Eastern Canada, the United States, and Europe, it settled the West, and it helped with the development of the agricultural industry, which was the backbone of Western Canada.
Certainly the elevator is an icon. It is, it's the thing that everybody has embedded in them as a descriptor of Saskatchewan. It is so prominent on our landscape because we really are quite flat, and it just, you can see it for 12 or 15 miles. It just is that very dominant shape, and with it comes a whole myth or a dream of, you know, the breadbasket of the world and the family farm and pioneers and homesteads and all of that life that used to be is just wrapped up with that symbol. So I think, in fact, it's a very potent symbol, particularly here. It sometimes feels like a cliche, but indeed, I think it has a very deep meaning for almost everyone who has lived here for any length of time.
Every 7 miles or every 8 miles there was another town, because that was about as far as you could haul a load of grain with a team of horses in an afternoon or a day or whatever. Where I grew up, it was a very small town, maybe had 300 people, and we had, when I was a kid, 5 grain elevators. So they were everywhere, and it was really the way that you marked where the next town was. You know, you can mark distance, how far things were by where the next where you saw the next grain elevators on the horizon. So it's such a dominant structure, building, you know, built thing on the flat landscape that we have. It really stood out and was quite striking. Not only, I'm sure, for me being a small kid, but you know, for adults and for everyone that lived here. I mean, they really were a landmark, both in terms of the psyche, but also in terms of the real physical feel of the place.
Buildings like grain elevators sprung from blueprints as well. It's interesting looking at the typical Saskatchewan wheat pool elevator. The drawings for those still exist. They were done in the 1920s. It's a beautiful set of drawings. It's very, very simple, very concise. Probably not done by an architectural firm, but by an engineering firm, because really those were truly industrial buildings.
The way the construction went was, once you had a good foundation in place, then you started with 2x6s on the flat in the lower level. Yes, the pressure was greatest at the bottom, and so some of the real big ones even had 2x8 on the flat at the bottom, then 2x6, then 2x4, up to the top of the bin level. Then it was frame construction around the head and the distribution facilities on the top. They would be a standard pattern for a short period until someone come up with a better solution, larger, for example. Like the earlier grain elevators were down as low as 20,000 bushels, and then we got up as high as 50,000, and then I think one of the ones we built was up to 170,000 bushels with the extensions off to the side. The elevator here came about to get some control of pricing. Part of that control came through the Canadian Wheat Board, and part of that control came through the formation of cooperative elevator companies such as Saskatchewan Consolidated Grain Company, or later the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool.
The Saskatchewan Wheat Pool was formed, and it proved to be very, very popular. They had to get 50% of the farmers in Saskatchewan signed up to contract to deliver to pool facilities.
The Saskatchewan Wheat Pool was born in 1924. They started off with elevator number 1 at Beaulieu, Saskatchewan. They numbered 2, 3, 4, and so on. Our elevator was built in 1928. It has a number on it of 901. So they either purchased or built 900 elevators in 4 years.
And they were able to form the company and go on the grain exchange. They were given a seat on the grain exchange in Winnipeg, and it grew to be the largest grain company in Canada.
I mean, I remember as a kid, on weekends we used to sneak into the elevator on occasion, and it was quite magical and impressive to see things on an industrial scale. You know, you'd see the chutes and there was a. I remember we would take the. There was a, I don't know what you call it, but it's a lift that the agent would get on to go to haul himself all the way up to the top of the bins in the elevator, and we'd take that and go up and sort of poke around up there. And usually I can remember on one occasion we actually had to climb down, because I think that those things, the way they worked is they were counterbalanced to the weight of the man that was on them. And of course one of us or two of us didn't add up to that, right? So we could take it up, but coming down was another story, right? We didn't have enough weight to get the thing to bring us down. So we took the long ladder down the chute.
Functions of the grain elevator were to collect the grain, to weigh it and grade it and store it, and then to distribute it through the rail system. In the early days, horse-drawn wagons come through this entrance on the west side, and they would come up over the pit, and this is covered with an iron grate.
Before he lifted this, the elevator agent would take a sample of the grain out of the vehicle and look, and then he would feel it and see if it was damp, and usually he got pretty good at feeling how damp it was. The agent would set the scales and weigh the whole truck with the grain in it. Then he would start unloading the grain, and then the grain would fall through these grates here and go into that pit. And when he's finished unloading the grain, he'd weigh the empty truck, and of course the difference between the full truck and the empty truck is the amount of grain that the farmer sold. This is part of the pit area here, and so you can see it is all sloped, and that means the grain all flows by gravity flow through the elevator other than the leg. And this is part of the leg. The belt is an endless belt which runs from the bottom of the pit to the top of the elevator, and you can see that the grain would the scoops would take the grain to the top of the elevator and put it into the Gerber hopper and through the Gerber system. For the number of bins in the elevator, the Gerber spout was connected to 21 different spouts. This is the elevator agent's computer. That's where he keeps track of what he has where. And so, for example, here in bin 13 he has number 1 CW barley in there and 3 tons of it. He might have wheat in here, he might have flax in here, and that's how he keeps track of what he has in which bin and maybe how full the bin is, the thing. So it's actually a diagram of the elevator and of the different bins that are in here.
The whole plant has been computerized to allow us to do specific blends. On the inward side, all grain is monitored going into all the bins, and tallies are made of protein levels, moisture levels, so that when we know that we want a certain blend, we can say, well, we want a certain percentage from this bin and that bin, bring it all together, blend it, and adjust it to whatever we need to make whatever recipe we need to make to hit the car. So yeah, we're fully modernized and computerized right through the whole plant.
These chutes here lead from the different bins. When the grain car was spotted on the siding, ready for loading, the elevator agent would be able to choose from which bin he was going to get the grain for shipment. It would come down here into this hopper where it would be weighed, and they would know how much they were going to be loading onto the grain car. Then it would go down and be re-elevated to a point about halfway up the elevator where that grain would come out the spout and out and into the boxcar.
But anyway, every small town had their set of elevators, and the local farmers would haul to that. Now, of course, with the kind of trucks and the kind of technologies that we have, not only to grow grain, but to harvest it and to transport it to market, all of that's changed. So the distances that the farmers travel are much greater. The machinery that they use to harvest is much bigger. The trucks that they use to haul it to market are much larger too. So all of that's changing, and changing, not only changing the dynamic, but really changing the look of the grain terminal and how it's situated and how it presents itself in our psyche, in our memory, as it were.
Well, the wheat pool had by far the most elevators in the province, so they want to consolidate. All the other companies have been consolidating down earlier. It began in the 70s and escalated in the 80s and 90s, and then of course really escalated around the year 2000. And so they want to consolidate down so that they don't have as many agents and helpers and those types of things. And so for them, it made more sense to close some of the smaller elevators and move into larger centers. They would offer farmers what they call the trucking bonus in order to haul to Saskatoon.
I think that the elevators certainly have become an icon for the generations that came before us, for the settlers who settled here, who had all the dreams that they brought with them when they came from all over Europe. That way of life isn't feasible now economically or environmentally. And so I think that the loss of the elevator is something that we have to simply acknowledge, and for the passing on into something new, and that new future for Saskatchewan has got to be sustainable agriculture, however that manifests itself in our province.
I computed the center of gravity of a grain elevator and became convinced that they were far more stable than most people thought. Quite possible to lift them up and haul them to a new location. To help demonstrate that it was feasible, we had a grain elevator at Console that we didn't need anymore, so I went down with a very large winch truck and hooked onto the top of the grain elevator, rolled it over onto its critical point where it was ready to roll over about 45 degrees from the ground, and then pulled it over until it crashed to the ground. And we found out that the grain elevator was capable of being hauled on severely steep hills and roads of questionable condition. We could salvage grain elevators from some point where they weren't needed anymore. If they were in good shape, we could load them up and haul them to some other location where they were needed.
Yeah, our capacity here, our best days have been around the 5,000 ton a day, which is roughly 200 trucks a day. That's running from 7 in the morning till 8 at night. We can load 112 grain cars in roughly 10 hours. We could probably handle in one day what they used to put through in a year in one of those wooden ones, the old wooden ones. The plant here in Weyburn, we're roughly about 50 people. That's our office staff, that's from top management all the way down to our fellows in the plant as well.
So what 1986 was, it was the World's Fair in Vancouver, and the Saskatchewan contribution was a pavilion. The Saskatchewan pavilion was modeled in the shape of a grain elevator. Part of the exhibition was a working model or working aspect to an actual grain elevator on the prairies.
A grain elevator located in a town is obviously important. It was the tallest building in town, and it usually carried the name of the town. It was considered important by the community to to have those grain elevators, and it was very disappointing to see them knocked down or hauled away.
When I set out to do these elevators, I think what I recognized is that there was a real need for us as a population to be able to mourn and to grieve and to acknowledge that the family farm as we know it just doesn't exist anymore. So instead of just being tough about it and just watching all these elevators come down, I thought it was important to honor them and say this is a memorial service. And so in fact, that's what I did. I created them in as honoring a way as I could. They toured all over Saskatchewan. A number of them did for a 2.5-year period.
I know that as long as I've been around, and I've lived all my life in the province, that there have been painters that have been painting grain elevators. And I think that they figured in paintings, both professional and particularly amateur, since probably they were built, probably the early years of the province. Some of the Saskatchewan folk artists, one of the best of them was Bill McCarger, who was, as it turns out, had been a train station agent as a profession. So he had very much first-hand knowledge of grain elevators and painted a lot of scenes, one of which you see over my shoulder in the background here, of looking down the tracks and seeing the elevators in the distance, and also a lot of them with the railroad tracks and the usual elevators in the far distance on the horizon. I mean, I find grain elevators really fascinating things to paint, because they are, again, such dominant things on the landscape, and particularly when you get up close and you see the scale of those things. What I'm finding interesting driving around is the new grain terminals, which everyone sort of makes faces about, but I find them quite interesting structures too. I mean, I think they're every bit as dramatic and maybe even more so than the old grain elevators. They're a little different than the historical elevators, because of course, first of all, they're much larger. Secondly, they're usually more distant in the landscape. They're not anymore really attached to one town or village.
When a grain company removes a grain elevator that isn't required there anymore, they have several reasons for doing that. Remove it and haul it away. First of all, they don't own the site. They lease it from the railroad. The other thing is that it's a grain elevator that's not used anymore. It could be a fire hazard, or it could be a nuisance in a community, and so unless somebody wants to take control of it and look after it.
We're going to do this, the same to this. They were going to knock this down, the company that was doing the demolition for them, and a couple of the ladies in town that knew that there was some historic significance to the elevator just told them that they weren't going to be doing that, and they were going to chain themselves if they had to stop them from demolishing this. And we'd known that there was some interest from the provincial government, the Heritage Branch. We didn't know the real significance of it at the time. We have decided with the Heritage Saskatchewan to accept their proposal, that it's to be restored to the original state as much as possible. The supplier of the tin, once we have that decision made, we're going to be able to proceed on phase 2. It's going to be a great facility, and a great tourist draw, and an educational facility for generations to come.
Well, we're one of those very fortunate communities that we have a real sturdy, strong elevator still standing. And so some of our citizens realized that when all the elevators were leaving Saskatchewan and the landmarks that they were, that we needed to do something about this. We had approached the wheat bowl about saving it, and they were particularly anxious about that. Perhaps they had some insight into the fact that down the way their name too would be disappearing. It will be restored as a museum. It will show how elevators worked and were used. Because we are on a harbor on Lake Diefenbaker, this elevator is really a lighthouse. And so we refer to it as our Prairie Lighthouse, and have for years, because all of the fishermen and the sailors use it as their beacon to come home.
You can see, we look over towards it's a great landmark for the boaters, and it's very visible right now to us, and we're a good 6-7 miles away from it. So it's a great guide to knowing how to get home. So
the big inland terminals, they're Their scale has made them, and their distance from each other has made them, in fact, much more impersonal. And so we haven't attached our feelings and our memories to them in the same way.
Well, when we realized our elevator would be closing, we came up with an idea to see if you could actually make this function as a museum. And we made a deal with Poole that they would sell us the elevator for $1, and they would do some work on the elevator instead of spending that money and knocking the elevator down. Well, our museum is here, as I mentioned at the beginning, to tell the story of wheat, sort of from farm gate, the farmer's story, and that, of course, includes community story.
I think that these large terminals will serve the same purpose eventually. You know, kids will grow up with those on the farm. You know, those kids that grow up on the farm will have the grain terminals in their memory in the same way that we have the old grain elevators in ours. And I think that they will be and are and will figure as much in the iconography for artists in the future as the old ones have.
Oh.